Let's now go over how to implement authenticated routes. To implement protected routes, we will make use of higher order components. Higher order components are simply functions that take in a component and return a new component. In this case, we'll take in the route component and return a protected route component. Doing this is not so hard. Let's create two new functional components. Let's create one called protected routes and one called unauth redirect. Simply pass in basic text to these components. Next, back in our routes.js file, let's create an arrow function called private route. This function will take two parameters, the component and auth. Auth will hold the authentication state. Next, in the code block, use the route component and pass in the render prop. We'll use props and then we'll use a conditional to check if the auth.isAuthenticated is equal to true. Then if true, we render the component, and if false, we redirect to the unauth redirect route, which we will set up. To redirect, we'll make use of the redirect component from React Router. Import it and set its path name to /redirect, which will automatically render the unauth redirect component. So now to set up the components in the router. Our unauth redirect can be set up as normal. Our private route, though, instead of using the route, we will use private route component instead. And since this returns a route component, this is fine to use here. And here we can also pass in our two props to the private component like so. Auth equals auth, which holds the entire auth object, and component equals private component, which is the component we want to render. And remember to also import these two components as well. Lastly, we need to set a link to the private component in our header, which we can set up normally. We don't have to set up a link to the unauth redirect since the component will render automatically. Now we can save everything and test our app. First, let's click on the private component while unauthenticated and see if we can access that route. As expected, clicking on the private route takes us to the redirect page. So let's sign in and see if we can access our authentication route. And yes, everything is working as expected. Clicking on the private route takes us to the private component after signing in. We have successfully set up authenticated routes, but there's still a couple of problems. We are already logged in, but we're still seeing the login button, and we do not have a way to log out yet. Let's fix these problems in the next section. Let's now fix our header so it shows the correct authentication button depending on whether the user is logged in or not. First, we need to convert the header into a React Redux container, and this is something we've seen before. We just need the map state to props function. Once we have done this, we can make our header aware of the isAuthenticated property of state. Remember to import the connect function. Next, let's pass in auth as a prop to the header component in the routes file. After this, we can pass in the login and logout methods from auth to the two buttons and set them up with a Churnier expression. The Churnier expression will check if isAuthenticated is not true and display the login button. And you can also do the opposite and check if isAuthenticated is true and display the logout button. Either way is fine. Finally, let's delete the login button from container 1. And we can check if this is working. And yes, we should be seeing the login button, and let's log in. And yes, we are now seeing the logout button, and if we click it, it turns back into the login button. Perfect. In a modern app, you essentially have to have third-party OAuth logins. So that's what we'll do here. Let's set up Google and Facebook OAuth logins. And let's first start with Google. Log into the Google Developer Console or create a Google account if you don't have one. Here are the steps. To keep things concise, I'll quickly set this up without narrating it. If you're confused, just refer back to the slide, but it is very simple and all the steps are here. Now let's go back to the Auth0 and click the try button. Let's copy the client ID and client secret generated by Google. And let's click try. And yes, it is working. Now for the Facebook setup. I will go through this in the same way I did for the Google OAuth. And again, all of these steps are here and it is very simple. It's not too hard. Let's click try. And yes, it is working. Let's now set up the profile component. We can use the profile component to automatically set up the user's info without them having to set it up manually. But first, let's console.log the auth result in our handle auth function to see what the authentication data we're working with is. So let's go to our home page and click on login. Let's sign in with our Google login that we set up in the last section. And yes, it does seem to be working as expected. Let's open up our auth result object and we can see that there's an ID token payload that contains all of the user info. So this is one way to extract the user's info. We can do it here in the handle auth method. So this is the easy way and it definitely works, but in my opinion, it doesn't make the code very readable. It will be hard for another engineer to come in and understand how and where we're getting the user's profile data from. So let's get the user's profile another way. We can get the user's profile with a given auth0 function. To set this up, we will use two functions. The first function we need will get the access token. Under our logout method, let's create a function called getAccessToken. This function will be an if-else statement that will check if an access token is in local storage. If yes, then we'll return the access token. If not, we can just return null. Next, let's create a getProfile function and start it off by declaring an access token variable. This variable will hold the result of the getAccessToken function. Then we declare an if statement that checks if the access token was returned. Next, we can use the given auth0 function called this.auth.client.userinfo that extracts the user's data. Inside the parentheses, we can use an arrow function with two parameters, and profile. Then, if we have a profile, we can extract it. To extract it, we can just save it in an empty user profile object. Declare an empty user profile object near the top of the class, and inside the if statement, set this.userProfile to the profile object. Finally, we need to call our function. Let's call the getProfile function in our handle auth method after setting the tokens in local storage and before our history.replace call. Great, so this is it for our auth.js file. We now need to use this in our auth check component. Since this function is called automatically, the only thing we need to do in the auth check is to save the user profile object to the Redux state with an action creator. So before we can use it in our auth check component, let's quickly set up the action creator to use this. We can do this in the next section. In this section, we'll set up our actions. As always, let's start in our action types file and declare two action types for adding and removing the user profile. Next, in our actions file, let's create two new action creators. The first one will be add profile. Remember to pass in a profile parameter here and also pass it to a payload property. The remove profile action can be set up as normal. Now we will set up the reducers for these actions in the auth reducer. Create a profile property and set it to null in the initial state. Then we can set up our case statements. Remember, the profile property will be set to action.payload in add profile and null in the remove profile. After this, we can set up our auth check component, which we will do in the next section. Now to set up the action dispatch in the auth check. We will not need to use a user profile from state in this component, so we just need to set up the action dispatch. So let's create two properties in the map dispatch to props called add profile and remove profile. Remember to pass in a profile argument to add profile. We will call these actions in the component didMount method under the login success action before the history replace call. In the this.props.addProfile action creator, pass in this.props.auth.userProfile. Remember, the get profile is called automatically, so the user data should be saved to the user profile object automatically. Also remember that this.props.addProfile is referring to our React Redux action creators, and this.props.auth.userProfile is referring to our regular React props. And in the else statement under login failure, we can call our remove profile action creator. Let's go to our auth file and increase the milliseconds to 2000, since I found 200 was too fast and the profile did not save to Redux. Instead of setting up our profile component, let's just test to see if it works by console.logging the user profile in our container1. Let's go to container1, and in the map dispatch to props method, let's create a property called user profile and set it to the profile property of the Redux state. Let's console.log it in our get state button. And let's save everything and test it out. First, let's click get state and we should see null. Good, that is our initial state. Next, let's log in. And if we click the get state button, we should see the profile data to our console. And yes, this is what we see. Let's just make sure and check our Redux dev tools to see if it's correct. And yes, it is working. So let's now create a component to dynamically render this data. In this section, we will dynamically render the user profile that we saved to the Redux store in the last section. Let's begin by creating a container that will house our profile data. And so we will need to do this in the containers directory. And of course, we will set this up as a React Redux container. As always, let's begin by setting up a React container with an empty div. We only need the map state to props function here. Now let's create a function to display the profile. Remember, we have to specify which property we want to display. We can't pass in the whole profile object. I will choose these 5 properties, but you can choose any properties that we saw in the console.log statement. Next, in the render method, we can just use this function and pass the profile in as a prop. This may look like a weird syntax, but it is totally valid. And we just now need to set up this component in our routes. Let's set this up as a private route since unauthenticated users shouldn't be able to access the profile page. Let's also create a link to the profile in the header for easy access. Let's just fix a small typo here back in the profile file. Now let's save and check our app. Let's sign in. And yes, it does seem to be working. Now to access our profile page. And yes, all our info is here. This pattern can also be used to display the user profile data from Auth0 and also Facebook. We have one problem in our app. When the user reloads the browser, all our state is gone. Our tokens, however, are still saved in local storage. Instead of having the user sign in again, we can do what's called a silent authentication. If expire time is valid, we can update our Redux state in the background. So let's log in. And let's reload the browser and see an example of this. And yes, if we check the Redux DevTools, we are getting is authenticated to false. If we go to the console.log and see the expire time and the access token, they are still there in the browser. So clearly the user should get automatically authenticated if for whatever reason they reloaded the page. Let's now create a silent authentication method with React and Redux. Doing this will be easy. We can simply copy the code from the auth check component and paste it to our routes component in the routes component did mount lifecycle method. Since routes is a root component, the component did mount method will be called every time a new component renders. So let's just copy our code from the auth check component and paste it here. We can also delete the history.replace call since this is a silent authentication and the user should be unaware of it and not be redirected. We also have to turn routes into a React Redux container, so let's do this now. Now that's it. We can change this.props to just auth. Since we declared auth in this component, we're no longer using it as a prop. The other this.props actions have to stay as is since they're being used by the map dispatch to props function. To check our app, let's also add the isAuthenticated property to our getState button. Let's save and test our app. So let's log in. And so far so good. Let's now reload the browser. And if we are still logged in, we should be seeing the true in the console. So let's click the getState method, the getState button. And yes, it is returning true. Let's check our Redux dev tools, and we immediately see the profile is now an empty object. This is because Redux takes some time to update the state, and we're dispatching our actions too quickly. So there's an easy fix for this. Let's go back to our app and add 2 lines of code. So we first have to call the getProfile method from auth. And then to slow down our action dispatch, we can just wrap it in a set timeout function for, let's say, 2000 milliseconds. Let's save and test. And yes, there is our profile. And just to really make sure, let's go back to our routes file and remove the component didMount method. Let's save and try again. And yes, as predicted, it's not working. So we can be completely sure that our app is functioning as intended. So in this section, I'll cover why I didn't go over Redux Thunk. Basically, any functionality offered by Redux Thunk can be accomplished without Redux Thunk. Redux Thunk is mainly syntax sugar, meaning it makes code slightly easier to read. But in my opinion, the difference is so small, it's not even worth the time to learn it for such a slight advantage. So below I've included a Stack Overflow link that goes over this. If you see the example, the difference between using Redux Thunk and not using it is literally 2 words. So for that reason, I did not think it was worth going over. So let's first discuss hooks. What are hooks? Hooks are basically referring to the ability to hook class functionality to a functional component. And it's mainly to allow functional components to read and update state. And this is completely new and something we haven't seen in previous versions of React. And not having to use classes makes both development easier and it improves performance. And I don't think classes or Redux is going to go away anytime soon, but in the future you will see more and more people migrate to React hooks. So now we can discuss the 2 rules of using hooks. So the first rule is that you cannot have nested hooks calls. So the hook has to be the top level function that's called. So you cannot put a use effect hook inside of a function. You have to put the function inside of the use of the hook, the use effect hook. And the second one is you cannot call hooks outside of the function. And I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not gonna insult your intelligence by writing an example. So here's a chart that gives a basic overview of the 4 main hooks. There are 10 total hooks, but these are the 4 main ones that you'll probably use the most. So obviously I'll go into more detail about each of these hooks, but let's just start with the basic overview. So first we have the useState hook, and this is similar to the setState function in the previous version of React. And this hook allows us to read and update state in a functional component. And again, like I mentioned, I'll go over the exact syntax and how it works in the next section. So next we have the useEffect hook, and this is similar to the component didMount lifecycle method in the previous version of React. And you'll basically use this when you want to call a function automatically when the component renders. After that, we have the useContext, and this is similar to React Redux, and it allows us to have a global state through the React Context API, which is a little bit different than hooks. Next, we have the useReducer hook, and this is also similar to React Redux, and it allows us to update the local component state through Redux actions and reducers. And just to note, it does not by itself globally update the state. So just because you use useReducer does not mean you're updating the state globally. It's only still in the local component state. The state is updated unless you use it with context, which we'll see how to do. So let's now discuss the first hook, which is useState. As mentioned in the last slide, useState is essentially the equivalent of setState, but it also initializes the state as well. In React classes, you initialize the state in the constructor function. Since functional components do not have a constructor property, you both change the state and initialize the state in one function, which is useState. And useState takes one parameter called the initial state, and this is basically the default value that you want to start off with. And the useState function returns an array of two elements. It returns the state value as the first element and setState function as the second element. And on the right hand side, I've shown you how it looks like without array destructuring. And without array destructuring, I think it makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. And both the value and set value are variable names that are user defined, and we can make them anything we want. To actually update the state, you use the function name, which is the second argument in the array destructuring, and you do not use the useState hook. And again, since this is a function, we're not using the this keyword anywhere, and we don't have to use props.setValue. We just call the function directly. And instead of using props.value, we also just use value just as is. And again, we don't need to use the state keyword anywhere either. So on the right hand side, I've also included syntax on how to work with multiple state properties. If you want another state property, you have to use the useState hook again. So using the useState hook again gives you a new value2 property and another setValue2 function. So essentially how you want to think about it is when you're using React useState hook, each value of the state, each property of the state has its own setState function, and it is initialized with the useState hook. So to change value2, you can only do it through the setValue2 function. You cannot change value1 in any way using that function. And this is important to understand because this is very different from how you use the setState function in React class components. So you just use useState once at the beginning of the file, which initializes one property of state and its own setState function. You then use that initialized function to change the state, and you don't use the useState hook to change the state after that. And again, this is important to understand because this is very different than using the setState function in class components. To read the state, you just pass in the variable name directly in curly brackets to the render method. And again, you don't have to use the state keyword or the props keyword. And similar to React classes, the component re-renders automatically when the state changes. So next we have the useEffect hook, and this is comparable to the component didMount lifecycle method in React classes. So there are three main ways you can use this hook. The first one is not passing in any second argument to the useEffect hook. And doing this will make it be called every time a component renders. The second one is you can pass in an empty array as a second argument to the useEffect. Doing this will make it so useEffect effect is only called when the component first mounts. And this is the exact same functionality as component did mount. The last way you can use it is you can pass in a value in the array to the useEffect hook. Doing this will make it so useEffect is called when that value changes. So again, in my last slide, I did mention we don't use a state keyword, and this is true as well. I just use state.value to convey that you can pass in a value of state here. And we'll see in more detail how this works in code, but for now, this should give you a good idea of how it works. Now we have the useReducer hook, and this hook essentially allows you to change the state through reducers and actions. And similar to the useState hook, we set it up in a similar way with array destructuring, where the first argument is the state value and the second argument is a function that changes the state. Unlike the useState hook, however, in the useReducer hook, we have to pass in a reducer as the first argument and then an initial state as the second argument. And similar to useState, in the array destructuring, state and dispatch are both user-defined variable names, and we could have called them anything we wanted. Actions are dispatched literally in the same exact way as they are in Redux. You don't have to make changes to either the actions or the action creators at all. To read state, you use state.state property, and state is not a reserved keyword, it's just the first argument we defined in the useReducer hook in the array destructuring, so we could have called it anything we wanted. State property though is a reserved word. It's the same state property that we set in the reducer in the initial state. If you need a refresher on reducers and actions, see the Redux module. So before discussing the useContext hook, let's first discuss what context is. So context is separate from React hooks. UseContext is a React hook, but context itself is not part of React hooks. And context is a way to pass down props from a parent component to a deeply nested child component. In regular React, props can only be passed to a direct child component of a parent component. A parent can't pass props to a child of a child component. And context is essentially what allows us to have a global state. So here's a diagram that shows how to read and update the state with context. So to read the state, you have to initialize all the state in app.js, the root parent component. Then each value can be passed in as a single property to the value prop of provider, which we will see in a second. Once that's done, any child component of app.js can access that state. Then any child component can access the value of that state by using dot notation on the property name that we provided in the value prop. Now we can go over updating state. So similar to reading state, the updating state is all done in app.js. So functions to change the state are all declared in app.js. Then the entire function is passed down as a prop to the child component. And it's passed in as a prop to the same value prop of the provider. Then to actually change the state in the child component calls the prop. Then when the child component calls the prop, it's passed up back to app.js where the state is changed. The state is not changed in the child component itself. So now that we understand context, let's go over the useContext hook. The very first thing you need to do is actually create the context. And this is very easy to do with just one line of code. So you can go in a separate context.js file, and then in a variable called context, you run react.createContext, and you can supply it any initial value that you want. The initial value is not important because it will get overridden in the value of the provider, the value prop of the provider, which we'll see in a second. And then you can just export default at the bottom. After you create the context, you have to import it in the root app.js file. And you can use the syntax I provided right here. After importing it to the root app.js file, you have to wrap all your routes with the context provider, as you see here. Then the context provider takes a value prop, which can be a JavaScript object that contains many properties itself. And these properties are all user defined, and you can make them either a value or an arrow function. And this is why I mentioned in the last slide that setting up the initial value in the context is irrelevant, because they're all updated right here in the value prop. So if you want to set values or functions, you have to do them here in the app.js file. Setting up props in the context file does not do anything. So far, we've been going over how to set up the context, but now we can see how to use the use context React hook. So the first thing we have to do is we have to import the entire context into the child component that we want to use it in. After importing it, we can initialize it like you see below. So simply pass in the entire context object to the use context React hook and save the value in a context variable. And then that's all you need to do to access the global state. In your render method, you can read the state with the following syntax: context, which is the variable name you initialized, and then state prop 1, which is a property we saw in the last slide that was applied to the value prop in the provider. And to set the state, you simply use the arrow function and then context dot update state. And remember, update state was the property name that we supplied to the value prop in the last slide. And finally, you can update the state in app.js through either use reducer or use state. Either one is fine. We can now go over the migration guide from Redux to React hooks. And migrating is actually very easy. You have to make very minimal changes. Actions do not have to be changed at all. You can leave them completely as is. And reducers don't really need to be changed either. Instead of exporting the default reducer, simply export both the initial state and the reducer. So don't use export default at the bottom. Then after exporting both the reducer and the initial state, simply pass both of them into the use reducer hook. And export and import actions as normal. And there's no changing actions. They're dispatched as normal as well. And of course, I'll go over an example in code to show you exactly how it's done. So here I made a table comparing the 6 different ways to read and update state in React. If you're ever confused, just refer back to this table. So we'll now put together everything we learned and build a React hook app. To keep things concise, we'll build on top of an existing React Redux app. And this is a very basic app. And we'll do this because this will allow you to see React hooks compared to React Redux side by side. And a lot of current projects still use Redux, so it's important to understand both approaches. And we won't change the existing React Redux code, but build React hooks separately from scratch and integrate them into our project. So we will now begin building out our app. The very first thing we need to do is use the correct version of React. To use React hooks, we have to use version 16.8 or higher. To get these versions, we have to go in the package.json file and manually add them. Running create React app does not give you the 16.8 version. After changing the version in package.json, save the file and delete your node modules folder. Then in the terminal, run npm install again. So the very first thing we'll do is convert our app class to a React hook. Doing so is very straightforward. Simply delete the class and extends component keyword. After that, we can just turn app into an arrow function. Next, we can just delete the render function and don't forget the closing bracket. And this is really it. We now have set up a React hook. Now let's create another directory called hooks where we will store all our other hooks. And in this hooks directory, let's create a file called hookscontainer1.js. And this will be the main hook we will be working with. And also, to save a little bit of time, we can just copy the code from app.js and paste it into our hooks container file. So let's just now import our hooks container one from ./hook/hooks container one. Let's also add a route for our hooks container, and we can call the route just hooks container. And finally, let's test our app. We can just manually add hooks container to the URL since we don't have a header link set up yet. And yes, it does seem to be working. We should be seeing React hooks, and this is what we see. In this section, we'll go over how to use the useState hook. The first thing we have to do is import useState, which we can do as following. After importing it, we can set it up as we saw in the slides, and we can use array destructuring. And remember, the first value of the array is the actual state value, and the second value is the setState function for that specific value. And we can initialize useState with a default value of 0. I'll also include how to set up useState without array destructuring as a comment. So let's just start off with a very basic example to see how useState works. We can create two functions that will either increment or decrement the initial value of 0. In our first increment value function, we can use setValue and then reference the state value and add 1. Remember from the slides, we don't have to use the this keyword or the state keyword. We reference the state and setState function directly. And we can do the same thing for the decrement value function as well. In our render method, we can create two buttons that will handle both these functions. And remember to pass in an arrow function to the onClick method of the button for each function. Let's now create another div and then pass in the text of local state. And in the curly brackets, we can display our actual state to the UI. And remember to also add the const keyword before each function, since again, this is not a class. Let's now go in the header file and create a link to our hooks container, which we didn't do in the last section. And we can just copy and paste the code to save some time. We can now save our file and go to our browser to see if it's working. And yep, it's working perfectly as expected. So this is basically how you would use the useState hook. In this section, we'll go over how to use the useEffect hook, and we will begin by importing it from React. Next, we can call the useEffect function under our useState call. And inside the parentheses, we can start off with an arrow function. Next, we can use a setTimeout function, and this would maybe simulate an API request to get some data from a database or server. And we'll use this useEffect hook with another property of state. And to add another property, of course, we need another useState function. So let's just, under our first useState function, let's just initialize a couple of values. We'll come back to this in 1 second. Inside of our setTimeout arrow function, we can call setUseEffectValue. And again, remember, this is just equivalent to this.setState. And we can pass in a value of useEffectWork. And we can use a 3000 millisecond timeout. And also notice in our setUseEffectValue call, we're not saying useEffectValue equals useEffectWork. We can just directly pass in the string. We don't need to reference the useEffectValue. In our render method, we can conditionally render useEffectValue. So if useEffectValue is true, we can just display that useEffectValue. If not, we can just display the text of no value. Next, we can just finish our second useState hook and just pass in an initial value of null. And you can also do an empty string if you like. And let's just go back to our render method and add a line break. And this line break just means to give a space between each HTML element if you weren't sure. And now we can test our app. And yes, it does seem to be working. In the slides, I also showed you that you can use the useEffect hook and call it when a value changes by passing in that value as an argument to the array. And we'll see how this works next. So let's go back to our editor and create a new function called change use effect value. And inside the arrow function, we'll set the use effect value to, let's just say, some string. Let's also create a button for it and pass in change use effect value to the onClick method. And finally, we can pass in state value to the array. And remember, state value is our first state property in the use effect hook. So basically what this code is supposed to do when state value changes, which we can change with the increment and decrement buttons. And if state value changes, then the use effect value will change to use effect work. And we have the change use effect value function to really make sure that it's working and that it's not just being called by set timeout. So let's save and test our app. So let's go to hooks container. And yes, the set timeout is working. This is what we should be saying. And yes, clicking our change use effect button should change the string, should change it to some string. Now if we click on the increment local state button, it should change state value to 1. And because state value changed to 1, our some string should go back to use effect worked. So let's click and see. And yes, it is working as expected. Perfect. In this section, we will go over the use reducer hook. And after importing it, we can initialize it with array destructuring. And remember, state and dispatch are user defined, and we could have called them anything. And our use reducer hooks takes 2 arguments, a reducer and an initial state. So let's actually create a reducer to work with our use reducer hook. In the store directory, let's create a hook state folder, and then we can create a hooks reducer.js file. And to save some time, we can just copy and paste our code from reducer1. Let's get rid of the export default call and export both the hooks reducer and the initial state as well. And here are the actions we will use. We don't need to change them at all. So let's import the reducer we just set up. And remember to import star as reducer since it's not export default anymore. Then we can pass in the reducer as the first argument to use reducer. And remember, the reducer.hooksReducer means the reducer that we set up in the import statement dot in the name of the reducer we set up in the hooks reducer file. And then we can set up the initial state in the same way. Next, we can import our actions the same way that we did our reducer. To handle our actions, let's create a arrow function called handle dispatch true. And then we can do dispatch and then in the parentheses actions.success. And again, the .success is an action creator that's coming from our actions.js file. And all it does is return the type of action types.success, which is just a string of success. And I'll also include 2 other dispatch methods on top of the actions.success call. And all these are 3 different ways to dispatch actions, and they're doing the same thing. They're returning a JavaScript object with a type property and a value of the string of success. And now we can create a handle dispatch false function, and this will dispatch the failure actions. And let's also create 2 new buttons to handle these functions. And let's pass in the functions to the onClick method in the same way we've been doing. And finally, in our render method, we can display some text depending on whether the property is true or false. So let's first start off with state dot. And remember, state is not a special keyword here. It's just the first argument in the user reducer call. And it was user defined and we could have made this anything. But since we're using use reducer, it's convention to just name it state in dispatch. Next, it would be state.stateProp1. And remember, stateProp1 is just a property in the initial state of our hooks reducer. And that's where we're getting it from our reducer. We don't have stateProp1 defined anywhere in this hooks container one. So let's finish off our ternary expression. So if stateProp1 is true, we can just display stateProp1 is true to the UI. And if false, we can just display stateProp1 is false. So let's save everything and check. And yes, we should be seeing stateProp1 is false because that was the initial value we set in our hooks reducer. And if we click the dispatch true button, it should change to stateProp1 is true. And yes, it is working. Perfect. So in the last section, we successfully set up the state in our React hook. However, we do have one problem. When our state works in the React component, but when we go to another component and then go back to our React hook does not save the state. This is because the state is reset when we navigate to another component and the state is not accessible globally. To fix this and have a sort of global state, we can implement React context. So here's a diagram to give a basic overview of how context works. And one of the most important things to understand about context is that all the state is initialized, contained, and updated in the root component. So on the left-hand side, we have the first diagram, which shows how to read the state. And this is a little bit different from what we've seen in Redux. So in context, basically the state is initialized in the root app.js component and then passed down as a prop to a child component. And since the app.js is the root component, all the other components are child components. And this is basically what allows us to have a sort of global state that can be read and updated in every component. And next on the right-hand side, we have the diagram to update the state. Updating the state is done in a similar manner to reading the state, where props are passed down to the child component. And these props contain a arrow function usually. But unlike reading state, to update the state, the props are actually passed back up to the app.js, where the state is actually changed. The state is not changed in the child component. And again, this is important to understand, and just to repeat myself a little bit, both the reading and updating state are done in the app.js component. And again, props are passed down through the value prop of the provider. And again, we'll see how this works in code in a second. So let's go back to our app and create a context.js file in our utils directory. In this file, we will initialize our context object. And the first thing we'll do is import React. Next, let's declare a variable called context. And we can set this variable equal to the value of react.createContext. And inside the context parentheses, include curly brackets, and then set prop1 to the value of false. And finally, we can just export the context at the bottom. And this is it. This is all we had to do to initialize our context object. Next, let's go to our app.js file and then import this context object we just created. To actually use this context object, we have to go in our render method and then declare context.provider as a functional component, and make sure you're wrapping routes with the context.provider. Also initialize a value prop to the context provider as well. This value prop is what will hold all of our props that will be passed down to child components. Next, let's give our app.js some state with the useState hook. And let's call it state global and set state global. Even though we're initializing and declaring our state in app.js, we'll be able to read and update the state from any other component in our app. Next, let's just create two basic functions to increment and decrement the global state. So even though we're declaring these functions in app.js, we will actually pass them down as properties to the value prop. And by passing them down as properties, we will be able to access them in every component in our app. And this is what will allow us to globally update the state. And inside of our increment and decrement functions, we're using the useState hook normally, as we've seen before. So let's now go to our value prop and pass in the state value itself and both of the functions to change the state value as properties. So let's first start with value global state. And this key is user defined and we can make it anything we want. And let's set the value of this to state global. And this is the name of our state value that we used in the useState hook, and it's not user defined. And then let's create two new properties called add global value and dec global value, and we'll set both of these properties to an arrow function that calls our increment and decrement global state functions. Then in our child component, as we'll see in a little bit, we'll actually call these properties and not the function itself. So in a child component, we'll essentially call this property, which will call the increment and decrement global state functions in app.js. So let's go to our hooks container one and import the context object. And this is not the context provider we just set up in app.js, but this is the first context object we set up in context.js. And let's also import the useContext hook, which we will use in combination with this context object. So to connect the useContext React hook with the context, it's actually very simple. Simply declare a context variable and then just pass in context to the useContext hook. And this is really it. This is all we need to do to access and update the global state. And to access it, we do context dot and then the name of the property that we set in the value prop. So let's write some code to see what this looks like. Let's now go to our global state and add two new buttons. One to increment the global state and the second one to decrement the global state. In the onClick method of our buttons, we can call the props to change the state by using the syntax context dot, and then remember the name of the property we set in the value prop, and not the name of the function that we set in app.js. So in our onClick method, it will be context dot add global value. And now we can go and display our global state value. Under the local state, let's create a paragraph and pass in the text of global state colon. Then to actually display the global state value, we can, in curly brackets, use the syntax context dot value global state. And remember, this is the property we set in the value prop of the provider in app.js. Now we can save everything and test our app. So we can go to our hooks container and then increment the global state. And just to really make sure, we can also increment the local state as well. After doing this, let's go back to the home components. And after coming back to the hooks container, as expected, we see local state went back to 0 and our global state is still as is. And this is perfect. This is the exact functionality we want. We want our global state to persist when we leave a certain component. So in the last section, we saw how to use the useState hook with the React context API. In this section, we will set up context with the useReducer hook. And this functionality will closely mimic Redux. Let's start off by creating a new property of state in our initial state in the hooks reducer. And let's just call it stateProp2 and initialize it to false. And instead of creating new actions for this one property, we can just add it to our already existing action types of success and failure. So just add it as a second property after stateProp1. So we're going to set up the useReducer hook in the exact same way that we did in hooks container 1. And to save some time, we can just copy and paste the code from that file. And in the import statements, remember to do // instead of //. And then in our use reducer variable names, let's change the names to state context global and dispatch context global. And then we can create two functions to handle dispatching actions in the exact same way that we did in hooks container 1. And to save some time, we can just copy and paste the code from there. There's no advantage to writing these functions from scratch. And just so we can tell them apart, let's change the names to handle context dispatch true and handle context dispatch false. Now we can go to our value prop and then pass in these functions to the properties. And we'll do this in a similar way that we did with the use state hook. Let's first set the value of the state, and let's call this property reducer global state. And to access the value, it's a little bit different than what we saw in use state hook. We actually do state context global dot state prop 2. And remember, state context global is the value we set as the variable name in the use reducer hook, and state prop 2 is actually the value we set in the initial state in actually the hooks reducer file. So unlike the use state hook, you actually have to specify the specific property because state context global holds both state prop 1 and state prop 2. To pass the functions down as props, we can do it literally the same exact way as we saw in use state. Let's declare a property called dispatch context true and then pass in an arrow function that calls the handle context dispatch true function. And we can do the same thing for the dispatching the failure action as well. So we're actually now done setting up the app.js file, and we can go back to our hooks container to use these properties we just set. So as we've been doing so far, we can create two buttons that will change the state first. And also we don't have to initialize the context because as you see at the top of the file, we already have it initialized. So we can just continue using this same context variable. We don't have to initialize another one for the use reducer hook. And again, to call the functions to change the state, we just do context.dispatch context true, which is just the name of the property we set in the value prop. And in our render method, we can also display the state prop 1 and access the reducer global state the same exact way that we did the value global state. So just do context.reducer global state. And since it's a boolean, we can pass in a paragraph text saying state prop 2 is true or false. And I'll just quickly summarize what's happening here. So context.reducer global state is a property we user defined in the value prop in app.js. And this reducer global state property holds the value of state context global dot state prop 2. And state context global is a variable we define that holds the value of the use reducer hook. And the use reducer hook can access the state prop 2 value we set in the hooks reducer.js file. So hopefully that helps you better understand the flow and where everything is coming from and how it works together. Oh, and let's just quickly fix a typo here. It should be dispatch context global, not just dispatch. And let's check our hooks container 1 file to see if we have any typos. And yes, it seems we're missing a closing p tag. And let's check the rest of our hooks container. And it seems to be fine, so let's save everything and check our browser. So let's go to our hooks container and then dispatch the context true action. And yes, state prop 2 is now true. So let's go to the home component and go back to our hooks container to see if the state persists. And yes, even though we went to another component, our state prop 2 is still true, which means it is working. So in this section, we will apply everything we've learned and create a form that uses all three ways of React hooks to update state. So let's start in our hooks directory and create a file called hooksform.js. And we can just initialize it as an empty div for now. We also need to declare a route for this, so let's go in our routes file and do this. And let's also create a link for it in our header. Now we can go back to our hooks form and begin setting it up. So at the top, we can import all our three main ways to update state with hooks, which is use state, use reducer, and use context. So we'll first start off with the use state hook, and we can set it up as we've seen before. And we can also initialize it with an empty string for now. And in our render method, we can create a form to work with this state. And let's also use a label of React.useState and an ID of useState as well. And since this is a form, we also need a piece of state to handle the change input. And a more detailed explanation on why, you can see the form tutorial in the React module. And to keep things consistent, we can also change our original state variable names to value submit and set value submit. So we basically now have two pieces of state, one to handle the change and one to handle the submit of the form. Next, we can create two new functions to handle each of these pieces of state. Then we can pass in the respective set function call inside of each function. And don't forget the event keyword. And finally, just pass in a reference to each function inside the form. And again, this is all something we've seen before. If you want a detailed explanation of each part of this, just see the React Forms tutorial in the React module. And finally, we can just display our React.useState values to the UI so we can see them both in real time. Finally, let's just add the event.preventDefault call in our submit function. And this is it for the useState hook. In the next section, we'll look at how to use the useReducer hook with the form. So in the last section, we saw how to set up state with React hooks and the useState hook. In this section, we'll see how to set up state with the useReducer hook. And let's also create two new actions to work with the useContext hook. Let's go in our action types file and create a user input change and user input submit action type. Next, in our actions file, let's create two new action creators to handle these action types. Let's just copy and paste your code to make it easier for ourselves. And remember to pass in text as a parameter and then set a payload property to text. And next, we need to create a reducer to work with these actions. So in the hook state directory, we can create a new reducer. And again, to save time, we can just copy and paste the code from our original hooks reducer. In our initial state in this reducer, let's create two properties called userTextChange and userTextSubmit. And let's change the name of the reducer to userReducer. And also let's pass in the action types that we set up in the last step. We are now done setting up the reducer and actions, and we can now import them into our hooks form. Next, we can pass in our userReducer to the useReducer hook in the same way we've seen before. And remember, it's a userReducer.userReducer. Next, let's create two new functions that will handle dispatching actions and changing our state. So let's call them handle use reducer change and handle use reducer submit. And then we can pass in dispatch and then actions.user input change. And user input change accepts a parameter of text, so we can pass in event.target.value, which holds the value of the text that we want to save to the state. And remember, the submit reducer will take event.target.userReducer.value. And again, remember, user input change is the name of our action creator. Next, in our render method, we will set up the form in the exact same way that we did with the useState hook. Simply copy and paste and then change everywhere it says useState to useReducer. And also remember to pass in the correct function references to onSubmit and onChange. And then let's also display the state for useReducer in the UI the same way we did with useState. And again, to save time, just copy and paste. And again, remember, these properties are coming from the initial state we set in the userReducer. Do userState.userTextChange and userTextSubmit. And let's also change dispatch to userDispatch, since that is the variable name we set in our useReducer call. And let's just look through our files and see if there's any typos. And yes, action types.userInputSubmit is spelled wrong, so let's just fix it really quick. And we also have a couple back in our hooks form. Let's add event.preventDefault and also change setValueChange to setValueSubmit. So this should be it. Let's save and test. As we type, we see, yes, it is working as expected. Submit does not follow change and it stays the way it should. Perfect. So in the last section, we successfully set up our hooks form with useReducer and useState. But as we know, that doesn't mean our state is available globally. So in this section, we'll set up our form with useContext. So as we've seen before, let's start off in our app.js file. And let's import our useReducer we set up previously. And then let's use the useReducer hook in the same way we've seen before. And let's call the variable names state user and dispatch user. And then we can just pass in our useReducer and our initial state. And since we're going to be using the same actions, let's just copy and paste the code from our hooks form that we set up in the useReducer hook in the last section. And then let's just make the required changes to these two functions. Let's change the name to useContextSubmit. And let's also do dispatch user. And we also need the event.persist function call. And this is really because context is a little bit strange. And since we're passing data up from a hooks form to the parent component, it doesn't always work perfectly. So you need this event.persist call to make it work without errors. So let's go in our value prop and then create a property to handle these functions. And let's name these properties useContextChange and useContextSubmit. And then let's use state user, and remember this is coming from the user defined variable name we declared above that holds the result of our useReducer hook call. And then for our second value, we can also use the state user keyword and then .userTextSubmit, because remember the useReducer hook contains the entire initial state. So we don't need to use another useReducer hook to access another property of our state in that reducer. And next, as we've seen before, let's just create two new properties to hold the arrow function for each of our dispatch action functions. And since the name is a little long, we can just copy and paste it here. Now let's go back to our hooks form and set up the context. So the very first thing we need to do is import the entire context object from utils/context. And then as we've seen before, we can just supply that context to the useContext hook and save the result in a variable called context. And then the same exact thing we've been doing, let's create another form to use with this useContext hook. And again, just change all the useReducer text to useContext. And one thing I always forget to do, let's change the submit function in our app.js file. So it should be event.target.useContext.value, since this is the ID we're going to set in the input. And remember, when we're passing in the reference to the function, in our onChange and onSubmit events, it's going to be useContextHandleChange and useContextHandleSubmit, which are the property names we set in the value prop in app.js. And following the same pattern as we've been doing so far, let's also display the state to the UI. So under the React useReducer UI display, we can just create another one for useContext. And then to display the UI, we use context.useContextSubmit. Since again, that's the name of the property we set in the value prop. We don't use stateUser.userInputText or anything like that. We have to use the property name in the value prop. And finally, we have to pass the event keyword to both of our arrow functions. So this is it. We can now test our app. So let's go to our browser. So yes, if we begin typing, we're getting the expected output on the screen. But to really test it, let's go back to the home component and go back to our hooks form. It should be saved even though we went to a different component. And perfect, it's working. So let's try something else. Let's try to display this state in another component actually. So we'll change the state from this component, but display it in our another one, in our hooks container. So let's go to our hooks container. And under the use effect value Turner expression, let's create another Turner expression. And again, we can just do context.user context submit in the same way we did in the form. And we don't have to initialize another context variable since we already have it initialized here. And then if user context submit is true, we can just display that text. And if not, we can just display no user text. So let's save and test our app. So in our hooks form, let's type in some random text and hit submit. Again, if we go to home and then go on the hooks container, yep, there it is, it's working. Our text is displayed that we submitted in the hooks form. So this is it. This is literally how you set up a global state with just React hooks. So by now you should be able to build upon everything you learned in this course and build up very complex apps. For example, authentication systems and API requests. Everything I've